You wake before the light has fully found its way through the thin curtains, the air in the small room, carrying the kind of chill that seems to sit deep in your bones. The fire in the grate is long since cold. Only a scatter of grey ash remains from the night before. The wooden floor beneath your feet feels hard and unwelcoming as you step from the bed, drawing a worn shawl around your shoulders. The kitchen, if it can be called that, is more a narrow space at the back of the house, a place where the brick hearth and a single shelf compete with a small table for room. You move through the quiet, the boards creaking softly under your weight, and reach for the cupboard. The hinges protest faintly as the door swings open, revealing the pantry. It is not empty, but neither is it full. A small sack of flour rests in the corner, the drawstring pulled tight to keep out the damp. Beside it, a jar of dripping, congealed at the top, glistens faintly in the half-light. A heel of bread sits, wrapped in cloth, its crust hardening. There are a few onions, their papery skins curling away, and a clutch of carrots dulled from storage. A tin of tea leaves waits on the top shelf, the lid fitting loosely after years of use. This is the reality of many homes in the Victorian streets, morning inventory of what will make it through the day. You measure with your eyes, thinking of how each bit might be stretched, flour into bread if there is fuel enough to bake it, carrots sliced thin to flavour a broth, a spoon of dripping melted to fry what little you have. There is no luxury here, only the steady arithmetic of making do. Outside, the faint rattle of a costermonger's cart drifts up from the street, the sound mingling with the calls of early vendors. You imagine their baskets piled with produce you cannot afford, the fresh smell of fish that will be gone from the stall long before you've set foot outside. Your hands wrap around the small tin of tea, feeling its cool metal sides. A cup of tea will warm you, if only a little. You set the kettle on the grate, coaxing a small flame from the few coals left in the scuttle. The water will take time to boil, but in that waiting there is a kind of rhythm, watching the faint plume of steam, feeling the room gather the day's first heat. The pantry remains open, the sight of its modest contents reminding you of the hours ahead. The bread, the flour, the few vegetables, they are more than nothing, yet less than comfort. And so, as the water begins to hum, you close the cupboard door softly, holding in mind the thought that today, like every day, will be made bearable not by plenty, but by the careful, quiet work of stretching what you have just far enough. The bread on the table looks wholesome enough at first glance, thick round with a browned crust, the kind you might imagine filling the kitchen with warmth when pulled from the oven. But when you cut into it, the truth reveals itself in the texture and the weight. This is not the fine white loaf of a prosperous household. This is bread stretched with whatever fillers can be found, made to go further than the flour alone would allow. In many working-class Victorian homes, wheat flour was too expensive to be used without alteration. The millers, or sometimes the bakers themselves, would mix in rye, barley, or ground oats to bulk it out. In harder times, the fillers could be less wholesome, mashed potatoes to give heft, old crusts dried and ground to be kneaded back into the dough, even sawdust fine bran that made each bite coarse in the mouth. It was a quiet deception, but one accepted, because it was necessary. You take a slice from the hardened heel left from yesterday. The crust cracks under the knife, scattering crumbs that you sweep into your palm, and nothing is wasted. The bread smells faintly of yeast, but also carries the dull earthiness of the added mash. In the leanest years, bakers were rumoured to add chalk or ground bones to whiten and strengthen the flour. You try not to think of that as you butter the slice with a thin smear of dripping. This loaf will have to last until the weekend market. That means each piece is cut thin, eaten slowly, sometimes dipped into broth to soften it. Children might gnaw the crusts for longer, keeping hunger at bay with the action more than the nourishment. Bread is the backbone of the table, but here it must bend and stretch to meet the needs of many mouths. In the corner, the flour sack waits, its sides slack. You'll measure out just enough for the next baking, no more than will fit in the small tin pot on the hearth. The thought of needing a fresh batch brings a flicker of comfort, though you know the fillers will be there again, binding the dough as much as the yeast does. On the street outside, the smell of a bakery drifts faintly on the damp air. The loaves there are larger, their crust smoother, their crumb finer. But those belong to another world, one just out of reach. Here, you will make do with what your hands can shape and your pantry can spare, stretching each loaf like a thin blanket over the cold space of hunger. The morning meal in much of the Victorian working class was not bread and butter at all, but something far humbler, a bowl of gruel or thin porridge, stretched to feed every member of the household. It was cheap, filling enough to quiet the stomach for a time and could be prepared over even the smallest fire. Gruel began with oats or barley, sometimes cracked wheat if it could be had. A handful of grain was boiled in water until the liquid turned cloudy and the starch thickened just enough to give the spoon some resistance. Milk was a luxury, rarely poured in except for the very young or the ill, and sugar, if it appeared at all, was measured in a few cautious grains, stirred until they disappeared completely. You stand by the hearth, the small pot balanced above a modest flame. The wooden spoon moves in slow circles, keeping the mixture from sticking. Steam curls upward, carrying a faint, earthy scent, more of boiled water than of oats. A pinch of salt is all you can add for flavour, and even that is a careful choice as alt costs, and you think of the small cone of it in the pantry, already shrinking week by week. When the gruel is ladled into bowls, it is thin enough that the liquid spreads quickly to the edges, leaving the grains scattered like small islands in a pale sea. For the children, you blow across the surface before handing it to them, knowing the heat is their only real comfort in the meal. They lift the bowls to their lips, drinking more than eating, leaving a faint ring behind when the liquid is gone. Sometimes, on better days, the porridge is thicker, allowed to simmer longer, perhaps with a scrap of suet or a splash of milk from a neighbour's tin. Those mornings feel like small feasts, the steam carrying a richer scent, the texture clinging to the spoon. But this is not one of those mornings. You scrape these last of the gruel from the pot, making sure nothing is left to waste. The wooden spoon, worn smooth from years of stirring, rests against the rim. The fire will be banked soon to save fuel until midday, and the pot set aside for its next humble duty. In the quiet after the meal, the bowls stacked and the children gone to their day's work or lessons, you can still feel the warmth of the gruel in your stomach. It will not last until nightfall, but for now it is enough to keep the day moving forward. By late morning, the narrow streets are alive with the calls of vendors, their voices cutting through the damp air. For many in the poorer quarters, the day's main meal doesn't come from a home kitchen at all, but from these street sellers cheap, quick and hot enough to fight the chill of the London fog. You step outside, shawl drawn tight, and the scents reach you before the sights do. The sharp salt of roasting herrings mingles with the earthy smell of baked potatoes steaming in their jackets. A man in a soot-blackened cap stands beside a small cart, its iron oven glowing red through the vent holes. He pulls out potatoes wrapped in paper, the skins blistered and split to reveal the fluffy flesh within. For a penny, he'll hand you one, and for another half-penny, he'll scrape in a spoon of butter if you can afford it. Farther along, a woman ladles from a pot of eel stew, the thick brown liquid clinging to each piece. Eels are cheap, pulled from the Thames in such numbers that they're sold by weight to anyone with a few coins. The stew's scent is heavy with onions and pepper, the spices masking the river's own flavour. Children clutch small bowls, blowing across the surface before dipping their spoons. Another cart sells oysters, shucked on the spot, a poor man's staple in this era when they are plentiful and inexpensive. They glisten pale against the dark half-shell, swallowed whole with a sprinkle of vinegar. To the wealthy, oysters might be an indulgence. Here, they are simply fuel. The sounds are constant, the hiss of hot oil as small fish are fried, the clink of coins dropping into open palms, the shuffle of boots along wet cobbles. A boy calls out hot chestnuts as he stirs them over coals, the shells cracking to reveal the sweet, steaming nut inside. For those who cannot buy a full meal, a paper twist of chestnuts is a warm comfort to carry in the hands. You watch as coins change hands quickly, the food disappearing into pockets and mouths before the sellers turn to the next customer. For many, these street meals are the only time of day they taste something hot. The fare is simple, often coarse, but it brings with it the comfort of warmth in the belly and a few moments of relief from the cold, grey streets. Inside the workhouse, the air is heavy with the mingled smells of damp clothing, boiled grain, and the faint, ever-present tang of disinfectant. The dining hall is a long, echoing space, its walls bare, its windows set high so that the light falls without granting much of a view. Wooden benches are arranged in rows, and the people seated upon them and on one side, women and children on the other wait in near silence for their food to be ladled out. A worker in a stained apron moves down the line with a large metal pot, dipping out portions into shallow bowls. The contents are a thin stew barley, a few carrot coins, perhaps the occasional shred of meat if the week's budget allowed. The liquid is pale and greasy, pooling around the solid bits. There is bread too, but it is coarse and heavy, cut into small squares to ensure it stretches far enough to feed everyone. You sit with the others, the rough wood of the bench pressing into the backs of your legs. The spoon in your hand feels cold at first, then warmer as you stir the stew, seeking the larger morsels before they sink. Around you, there is the sound of quiet eating, the clink of spoons against enamel, the faint slurp as someone draws the broth from the edge of the bowl. No one lingers. Meals here are for sustenance, not pleasure. The workhouse menu rarely changes. Breakfast might be thin porridge, lunch a vegetable broth, supper more of the same, or perhaps bread with a smear of dripping. On better days, there might be soup pudding, dense and plain, served in small squares that fill the stomach if not the heart. Everything is portioned with care, measured to the ounce, overseen by rules that leave no room for indulgence. The sum, these meals are a relief, regular, predictable, better than the uncertainty outside. For others, they are a constant reminder of dependence, each ladleful a measure of both necessity and resignation. As you finish, you mop the last drops of broth with the edge of your bread, swallowing quickly before the overseer calls for the bowls to be collected. The hall empties as quietly as it filled, the bench is bare again until the next mealtime. Outside, the world may be harsh and uncertain, but in the workhouse dining room, there is at least the guarantee of something warm in the stomach, however thin, however plain, day after day. In the dim light of a Victorian kitchen, tea is more than a drink, it is a lifeline. For the working poor, it offers warmth, a small comfort in the chill of an unheated room, and just enough stimulation to push through the long hours ahead. The kettle, dented and blackened from years over the fire, is one of the most valued possessions in the household. You lift it from the hook above the hearth, feeling its surprising weight. The water inside is yesterday's, drawn from the pump and covered to keep out dust. You set it back on the grate, coaxing a low flame from the coals until the water begins to hum, then tremble into a boil. The steam drifts up, bringing with it a promise of comfort. The tea leaves themselves are precious and rarely new. In many homes, they are reused several times, dried on a plate by the fire after the first steep, then brewed again until they surrender the last of their colour and flavour. Some households stretch them further still, mixing the leaves with dried herbs or even ground-up twigs to fill out the measure. It is not the tea of the wealthy with their imported chests and silver spoons, but it is tea nonetheless. When the brew is ready, it is poured into thick, chipped mugs, the liquid a deep brown if you are lucky, paler if the leaves have been used too many times. A spoon of sugar, if available, turns it into something almost indulgent, though many make do without. Milk, when present, is added sparingly, just enough to soften the bite of tannin on the tongue. You wrap your hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into your fingers. The first sip carries more comfort than flavour, the warmth spreading down into your chest. For a moment, the ache in your joints eases, the damp chill of the house recedes, and you can imagine facing the tasks of the day with steadier hands. For dock workers, seamstresses, factory hands, and labourers alike, tea breaks the monotony of hardship. It is a pause, a breath, a small ritual that says, you have made it this far, you can go a little further. And when the cup is drained, the world may feel just as heavy, but your body, warmed and stirred, is ready to shoulder it again. For many Victorian households of modest means, meat was not a daily staple but a rare and notable event, something looked forward to all week, often reserved for Sunday when the day's rest and family gathering made it feel almost like a celebration. In the markets, the cuts affordable to the poor were not the glossy roasts displayed in a butcher's front window. Those went to the tables of merchants and the well-to-do. What you could afford was often smaller, plainer, and only occasionally fresh. A small joint of mutton, perhaps, or a scrag end of beef. Sometimes it was salted pork kept in a brine barrel at the shop that you bought by the pound, its meat dense and a little tough, needing hours of slow boiling to become tender enough to chew. The week's plan revolved around that single meal. On Saturday, you might queue at the butcher's stall, eyeing each cut as the customers ahead made their choices. You would calculate, coin by coin, how much you could take home, weighing whether to buy more meat of lesser quality or a smaller portion of something better. The decision was rarely easy, but the thought of the meal to come made it bearable. On Sunday morning, the kitchen would smell different. The fire was lit early, the pot set to simmer. If it was a joint of meat, it might be roasted slowly on a spit before the hearth, turned now and again so that its juices ran evenly. If boiling was the method, the meat would rest in a large pot with carrots, onions, and perhaps a few potatoes, the broth growing richer with each passing hour. When the moment came to serve it, The meat would be sliced thin to make it stretch, each plate receiving just enough to satisfy without exhausting the supply. Any broth left behind would be carefully saved for the week ahead, forming the base of soups or gravies to flavor the otherwise plain meals. Children might gnaw the bones clean, adults chew more slowly, making the taste last as long as possible. The satisfaction was not only in the eating, but in the sense of fullness it brought a luxury when so many days were marked by hunger. As the plates were cleared, you would already be thinking ahead to next week's meat day. The taste lingered, but so too did the knowledge that it would be some time before the table bore such a dish again. In the rhythm of scarcity, that single weekly serving became more than food, it was hope made tangible, a reminder that even in hard times, small celebrations could still find a place at the table. If prime cuts of meat were a rare treat, the everyday reality for many working-class Victorian families was the cheap, overlooked parts, the organs, scraps, and trimmings politely called offal. These were the portions left after the choice cuts had gone to wealthier homes: the heart, liver, kidneys, tongue, tripe, even the feet and heads of animals. What others dismissed, you learned to prepare with care, coaxing flavor from what was available. In the market, offal was displayed without ceremony, laid out on rough boards or hanging from hooks. The air there was sharp with the scent of raw meat, sometimes overlaid by the metallic tang of fresh blood. The housewife with a careful eye might choose a calf's liver for its smooth, unblemished surface, or a sheep's heart that was plump and firm. Because these cuts spoiled quickly, they were often cheaper late in the day, when the sellers were eager to be rid of them before the night. Back home, preparation began with cleaning through washing in cold water, sometimes soaking in a solution of vinegar to remove strong odors. Liver might be sliced thin and fried with onions, the richness of the meat balanced by the sweetness of the vegetable. Hearts were often stewed for hours, stuffed with breadcrumbs and herbs if the budget allowed. Tripe, the pale lining of a cow's stomach, required long boiling to soften, then might be served in milk with a sprinkle of parsley. Kidneys were a common choice for pies. Their flavour was bold, not to everyone's liking, but when minced finely and mixed with suet, gravy, and bits of leftover vegetables, they could make a filling meal enclosed in a sturdy crust. Even pig's feet and sheep's heads were not wasted boiled down. They produced a rich stock thick with natural gelatine, turned into a jelly that set as it cooled. Cooking offal was as much about thrift as about taste. These cuts were dense with nourishment, and when prepared well, they could feed a family at a fraction of the cost of prime meat. They were the quiet backbone of the poor man's table, humble, unglamorous, but dependable. On a cold evening, the steam from a pot of stewing hearts or simmering tripe filled the kitchen with a scent both comforting and earthy. The dishes were hearty enough to satisfy, and in their own way, they carried the pride of making much from little skill every Victorian housewife had to master. In a Victorian home, especially one with little to spare, the ability to make food last through the lean months was as valuable as the food itself. Pickling and preserving were not luxuries, they were survival skills, passed from one generation to the next, and practiced in kitchens that might otherwise have been bare by winter's end. The preserving season began in earnest during the summer and early autumn, when markets and gardens overflowed. Even the poorest households would find a way to put aside a few jars or crocks. Cucumbers, cabbages, onions and beetroot were sliced, salted and soaked in vinegar infused with mustard seeds, peppercorns and bay leaves. The sharp scent would fill the room, biting at the eyes, but promising flavour in the months to come. Salt was a constant companion in this work. Fish could be rubbed and layered with it until every surface was protected, then packed into barrels. Meats, particularly pork, were preserved in heavy brine, turning the flesh firm and giving it a salty tang that kept hunger at bay deep into the cold season. The salt was not wasted after the meat was gone. Brine could be reused, boiled, and strengthened for another batch. Jam making was a quieter, sweeter task. Any fruit that could be spared, windfall apples, blackberries from the hedgerow, or gooseberries bought cheaply when in glute, was stewed with sugar until thick and bubbling. Sugar itself was costly, so the amount was carefully measured, sometimes reduced with the addition of treacle for sweetness. The finished jam was poured into jars and covered with paper or waxed cloth, the tops tied down with string. For many, these jars and crocks were more than stored food. They were a visible reassurance against the fear of the hungry gap when fresh supplies were scarce. In the dark of January or February, opening a jar of pickled onions brought back the taste of the harvest, sharp and bright against the monotony of bread and dripping. A spoonful of jam on a crust transformed it into something almost indulgent. Preserving was labour-intensive and often done at the end of long working days, but it was also communal. Neighbours might trade pickled cabbage for salted herring, a jar of jam for a crock of cured pork, each exchange weaving the ties of mutual survival a little tighter. In the quiet winter evenings, these flavours carried the memory of warmer days, a reminder that the seasons would turn again. In the Victorian kitchen, vegetables were not the abundant, year-round variety found in modern shops. They followed the strict rhythm of the seasons, appearing in plenty for a short while, then disappearing entirely until the next harvest. For families with tight purses, this seasonality dictated the very shape of their diet. In the colder months, the table leaned heavily on hardy roots and brassicas, carrots, turnips, parsnips, and the ever-present cabbage. These vegetables kept well in a cool cellar or buried in a clamp outdoors, their skins protecting the flesh within. Cabbage in particular was a constant companion, boiled until soft, chopped into broths or fried in a pan with a scrap of dripping for flavour. Its strong smell filled the kitchen and clung to clothing, a scent both comforting and unshakable. Potatoes, though cheap and filling, were not always reliable. A bad season could send prices climbing, and disease could wipe out entire crops. When plentiful, they were boiled, mashed, roasted, or sliced into pies, their mild flavour acting as a backdrop to whatever scraps of meat or gravy could be found. In the leanest weeks, a potato with salt might be the only thing on a plate. Spring brought a brief freshness, green peas, young carrots, tender lettuces. These were eaten quickly, for they did not store well, and their presence felt like a promise that the hard months were truly ending. Summer markets overflowed with beans, cucumbers, tomatoes and leafy greens, often sold cheaply in gluts, prompting hurried preserving or pickling. For the poorest, vegetables from the market were sometimes supplemented or replaced by what could be gathered. Wild greens like nettles or dandelion leaves were boiled for soup, blackberries picked from hedgerows for puddings, mushrooms collected cautiously from the edges of fields. Such foraging was not romantic, but practical. Every free addition to the pot meant the purchased stores could last a little longer. Without refrigeration, every vegetable was treated with urgency. The cabbage might be eaten over several days, the outer leaves stripped and cooked first, the core saved for shredding into soup. Nothing went to waste. Even peelings could flavour a broth. The flavours were simple, the season's variety narrow, but in their own way, these vegetables formed the backbone of survival, quiet, humble, and essential. Sweetness was a rare luxury in the harsh rhythm of Victorian working-class life, but even in the leanest households, there were moments when a few pennies could buy a small indulgence. These treats were not grand desserts or lavish puddings, but humble, affordable pleasures enough to make a child's eyes brighten or to mark a special day with something beyond the ordinary. In the streets, costermongers and sweet sellers carried their goods in trays or baskets, calling out to passers-by. Boiled sweet small, hard drops tinted with cheap dyes are sold by the ounce in twisty paper cones. The colours were bright, the flavours simple, peppermint, aniseed, lemon, barley sugar. The children, even one sweet could be made to last, tucked in a cheek and slowly dissolved until nothing remained but the memory. Treacle toffee was another favourite, brittle and sticky in equal measure. Broken into jagged shards, it could be bought for a farthing or two, wrapped in scraps of paper that soon became transparent from the sugar's touch. For those with a bit more to spend, there were sponge cakes from the bakery, slightly stale by the end of the day, sold cheaply before closing. At home, thrifty mothers found ways to make sweet things from what they had. Bread pudding was a common sight, stale crusts soaked in milk or water, mixed with suet, dried fruit if available and sweetened with a spoon of treacle or molasses. It was baked until firm, then sliced into thick wedges, served warm when possible. On rare occasions, a pot of rice pudding would simmer on the hearth, the grains swollen with milk, sweetened just enough to turn the plain into the comforting. Fruit, too, could be a treat: an apple saved from market day, a handful of blackberries picked from the hedgerow, a plum purchased for a halfpenny in the summer glut. These small treasures were eaten slowly, sometimes divided so that each member of the family had a share. Such sweets were never taken for granted. They punctuated the long stretches of plain fare, offering not only flavour but a change in mood, a reminder that pleasure could still be found even in modest circumstances. And for the children who ran through the cobbled streets with a sticky sweet clutched in their hands, those moments of sugar and light became memories far richer than the price ever paid. Evening in a modest Victorian home often arrived before the daylight was truly gone, the windows clouded with soot and the narrow streets outside casting shadows long before sunset. In winter, the darkness came quickly, and the evening meal was taken by candlelight or the dim glow of an oil lamp set in the center of the table. The candle was not lit early. Wax and tallow were both dear, and light was used sparingly. A single flame, perhaps two on Sundays, was enough to cast a small circle of gold on the worn boards. Beyond its reach, the rest of the room dissolved into soft shadow. Light danced against the walls, catching on the curves of tin spoons and the surface of clay bowls. The meal itself was simple. Perhaps bread with a smear of dripping, or a portion of broth left from the midday pot. On better nights, there might be a slice of cold meat from the Sunday joint, accompanied by cabbage or carrots reheated over the fire. Children leaned close to their bowls, spoons clinking quietly, the steam from their food fogging the air just above the table. The candlelight softened everything: the hard lines of the table, the wear on the crockery, even the faces of those gathered. It lent a kind of intimacy to the act of eating, as if the whole household had drawn in tight around this one shared moment before the night closed in completely. Outside, the world felt far away. The muffled sound of cart wheels on cobblestones drifted through the thin walls, joined now and then by a neighbour's voice calling across the street. But inside, the candle's glow created a boundary, a small island of light and warmth in the surrounding dark. When the meal was finished, the scraps were gathered quickly, saved if they could be used, scraped into the pail if they could not. The candle might be snuffed out soon after, the family retiring early to save both fuel and the cost of light. Yet for that short time, eating by candlelight was more than necessity. It was a quiet ritual, a reminder that even in the humblest of rooms, the day could end with the simple comfort of food, light, and company. In the poorer quarters of Victorian towns, survival often depended as much on relationships as on money. When wages were thin and the pantry nearly bare, neighbours turned to one another not with coin, but with the quiet exchanges of borrowing and bartering that kept hunger at bay. It was not unusual for a knock to sound at the door in the early evening, followed by a familiar face in the flickering light of the hallway. "A cup of flour, if you've any to spare," they might ask, or a bit of dripping just enough for the morning. These requests carried no shame. They were part of the unspoken agreement that, one day soon, the fare would be returned. Sometimes the trade was direct and immediate. A jar of pickled cabbage might be swapped for a small portion of salted herring. A heel of bread, still warm from the oven, could be traded for a pint of milk fresh from the morning's delivery. When goods were scarce, services could stand in their place. A neighbour might offer to mend a torn coat in exchange for a few scoops of sugar, or watch the children while their mother went to queue at the bakery. Bartering happened between households, but also with small shopkeepers who knew their customers well. The grocer at the corner might extend credit until payday, trusting that the debt would be repaid in full, or accept payment in the form of home-sewn garments, baskets of foraged berries, or jars of homemade jam. Trust was as much a currency as the coins themselves. These exchanges created a web of interdependence. In hard winters, it was often this network of favours and swaps that meant the difference between a meal on the table and going without. The memory of who had helped in times of need stayed with people for years, passed along in quiet stories told over tea. When the bartered goods were finally used, a stew thickened by the borrowed flour, bread sweetened by a neighbour's spoon of treacle, they carried more than just nourishment. They brought with them the warmth of knowing that in a world often indifferent to the struggles of the poor, there were still those who saw, understood, and quietly shared what little they had. In the cold heart of a Victorian winter, when wages failed to stretch and pantries echoed with emptiness, the doors of the charity kitchens became beacons in the grey streets. These places, sometimes called soup kitchens or relief kitchens, are often set up by churches, philanthropic societies, or wealthy benefactors seeking to ease the sharpest edge of hunger. From early morning, queues would form along the pavement, women with shawls wrapped tight against the wind, children clutching tin mugs or battered bowls, men standing silently with caps pulled low. The smell drifted out into the street, a mingling of boiling vegetables, onions, and the faint tang of meat stock. It was not a feast, but it was hot, and it was filling. Inside, long trestle tables held great iron cauldrons where the soup simmered in steady bubbles. Volunteers ladled portions into whatever vessels people had brought: a cracked bowl, an old jug, even a clean jam jar. The broth was often thin, bulked out with barley or lentils, with scraps of meat so small they might dissolve into the liquid. Yet to empty stomachs, it was a gift of warmth and sustenance. Alongside the soup, there might be bread-thick, uneven slices cut from coarse loaves. Sometimes, in better-funded kitchens, tea was poured into enamel mugs, its heat almost as welcome as the food itself. For the youngest children, a spoonful of treacle or a piece of fruit was given, small luxuries that brought shy smiles. These kitchens were more than just places to eat. For those who came, they offered a brief respite from the cold and the strain of scraping together meals at home. Neighbours met in the queue and exchanged news, mothers traded advice, and children found companions for the walk back. The meals were free, but they were not without cost in pride. Many would only come when the cupboards were truly bare, stepping through the doors with lowered eyes. Yet the relief was undeniable, the knowledge that, at least for today, no one in the family would go to bed hungry. When the pots were empty and the doors closed for the night, the smell of broth still lingered in the air outside, a reminder of the quiet lifeline these kitchens provided in a city where survival was often a communal effort. The fire in the hearth has long since faded to ash, its last glow swallowed by the dark. The house is quiet, the sounds of the street outside replaced by the stillness of night. In the small bedroom, the air is cool enough that each breath feels sharp, yet there is no heaviness of food to warm you from within. Tonight, the pantry was too bare, the coins too few, and supper was little more than a crust of bread or a thin cup of tea. You settle into bed, the mattress uneven beneath you, pulling the thin blanket high around your shoulders. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and soap, a comfort in its familiarity. The room is dim, lit only by a faint trace of moonlight slipping between the edges of the curtain. The quiet makes the absence in your stomach more noticeably, an emptiness that seems to echo in the stillness. Hunger has a way of making time slow. You listen for anything to distract from it, the distant rattle of a cart's wheels somewhere far down the cobblestones, the muted murmur of a neighbour's voice through the wall, the irregular tap of a loose shutter in the wind. The sounds come and go, leaving you again with the quiet thrum of your own heartbeat. There is no sense in rising. The cupboard will look no fuller than it did hours ago. You turn on your side, curling your knees toward your chest to make the hollow in your stomach feel smaller. This is not the first time you've gone to bed hungry, nor will it be the last, but the body still protests each time. Slowly, the chill of the sheets begins to fade as your own warmth gathers under the blanket. The hunger is still there, but drowsiness comes in spite of it, wrapping itself around you like another layer. Tomorrow will bring another chance, another stretch of coins, another attempt to fill the larder, another pot set to boil over the hearth. For now, you let the night take you, empty-bellied but still holding onto the small thread of hope that has carried you through so many days before. The lamps have all been put out now, leaving the narrow Victorian street in a hush broken only by the occasional distant wheel on cobblestones. Inside the small house, the last embers in the hearth glow faintly, their light too soft to see by, but enough to hold a sense of warmth in the room. The air is cool, wrapping gently around you like the night itself. The sounds of the day are gone. No voices calling from market stalls, no rattle of carts, no clink of coins in a shopkeeper's till. Instead, there is only the soft settling of the house, the creak of a cooling beam, the whisper of fabric shifting as you draw the blanket closer. The scents linger faintly, bread baked earlier in the week, a trace of tea from the evening, the quiet, earthy smell of potatoes stored in the corner. You are lying still now, your body sinking deeper into the worn mattress. The hunger that followed you to bed has softened into something quieter, like a wave that has ebbed but not yet disappeared. Your breath has slowed, each inhale and exhale steady and calm. The room feels smaller in the dark, more sheltered, as though the walls are drawing in to keep the night air at bay. Beyond the window, the moon drifts slowly across the sky, its pale light touching the rooftops. The city sleeps, and with it, every worry and task of the day is set aside. Tomorrow will come soon enough with its work, its challenges, and its quiet moments of comfort, but for now, you are simply here, in the stillness, letting rest take hold. The night is deep, the blanket is warm, and sleep comes gently, carrying you toward morning.